Hello, everyone. Today's topic has been especially created for parents and is titled It's Not Just Loud, and it's all about the neuroscience of noise. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Giulia Poerio to this conversation. Giulia is a psychologist and a researcher with the University of Sussex, and her work focuses on the science behind autonomous sensory meridian response, or ASMR, which is a phenomenon many people experience as a deeply calming response to some certain gentle sounds and sensory cues. Over the past decade, Julia has been one of the leading researchers exploring how ASMR affects the body and the mind, including how it can influence relaxation and emotional well-being and stress. It's a fascinating subject. At the Peace Path and HushAway, we're very interested in the role that sound can play in supporting emotional regulation, especially for children, because this is where we feel that we can have an impact. And these children who may be overwhelmed by the pace and the stimulation of the modern world. Julia joins these Peace Path conversations as a research advisor, helping us ensure that the ideas that we explore around sound and calm and regulation remain thoughtful, responsible, and grounded in evidence. Today, we're exploring something that many parents notice but may not always understand, and that is noise in our home is not just about volume. It's about how the brain processes sound and how that affects how children can feel. So, Julia, thank you for being here. We're absolutely honoured to have you in this space.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Julia, when parents think about noise at home, they often think about something simply being loud. But from a neuroscience perspective, what is actually happening in the brain when children are surrounded by this constant background noise at home?
Yeah, so our brain is, of course, responding to loudness when it comes to sound and noise, but there's actually a lot more that's going on. We are constantly evaluating information that's coming from our sensory systems, including kind of the auditory system, and this is happening across a 24-hour period. Even when you are asleep, a loud sound like a fire alarm or something like that is still going to wake you up. So our brains are kind of constantly processing auditory information and evaluating whether the sounds are kind of relevant to us in that context, and if they are, whether they might be threatening, or whether that sound is okay, it should be ignored and filtered out and not pay attention to it. And so that means that kind of what we might consider to be background noises. So, the TV playing in the background, somebody, the dishwasher clanking, traffic noises from outside, this information isn't just going to be completely ignored by the brain. It's going to be processed still, and be actively filtered. So what's difficult sometimes is it's when you've got multiple sources of kind of competing auditory information, and your brain's kind of having to work to actively process it, which is going to require you to use energy and kind of neural energy and resources and your attentional resources as well. So this is something that, we're kind of doing all the time. And then the more sensory input that you've got, the more that you're having to kind of deal with. Of course, it is very important that we are able to kind of tag certain sound as important. So, sudden noises particularly grab our attention because they can often signal danger and things like that. We also tend to prioritize processing of speech. So that could also be more distracting as well. But yes, there's lots of different things that are going on in the home environment that aren't necessarily loud sounds that are placing kind of demands on our auditory and sensory systems.
Mhm. And many parents notice that one child may cope really easily with the noise, while another child can become overwhelmed so quickly. So, why is it that some children experience sound much more intensely than others?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It really speaks to the idea of differences or individual differences in sensory sensitivity or auditory sensitivity in our case. So some people will be processing the same auditory information in much greater depth. So you might find, children who are able to notice subtle sounds that others aren't. They may also be much more reactive to certain sounds. So their bodily reactions, their emotional reactions might be heightened, and they maybe be less able to kind of filter them out as kind of background noise. So, then unable to kind of ignore and filter out that background information. And this is really to do with the different ways that different brains process sensory information. People with high sensory sensitivity are going to have much lower thresholds for sensory input to reach kind of conscious processing. So, this can obviously have an effect on emotional experiences as well. And often, if you're somebody who's very sensitive to auditory information, certain sounds might feel, louder to you, and you're less able to kind of habituate to them. So they don't just sort of fade into the background. It might be that for a lot of us, we hear a clock ticking in the background, we're able to just kind of filter that out. But if you're very sensitive, you might not be able to kind of filter that out.
Mhm.
So there's different sensory profiles have difficulties in kind of processing information, and by processing things in more depth can be quite cognitively and emotionally demanding.
And when a child is overwhelmed by this noise, what's really happening in their nervous system?
Yeah, so I think, there's probably lots of things happening, but, having too much sensory input, or sensory input that's very unpredictable, so we're not sure what's happening with it. Our nervous system's essentially sort of treating this unpredictability, or the amount of sensory information that we're processing, a bit like a threat, or as a signal that the environment that we're currently in isn't safe. And when that happens in these circumstances, what the body is doing is essentially prioritizing survival, even if there isn't a survival threat. So what it will do is kind of mobilize the sympathetic nervous system, which is often kind of called our fight or flight or freeze response. And so that can subjectively be experienced as kind of physiological arousal and then negative emotional states. And we can also measure that in things like autonomic responses, so things like heart rate, sweating responses, skin temperature. And these things kind of indicate activation of the nervous system, particularly the sympathetic nervous system. So that's really kind of what's happening, is that our body is trying to prioritize survival because it thinks it isn't safe in many ways.
Mhm. And just back to the home and that environment, because many homes today have this constant background noise of televisions and tablets, and you mentioned the washing machine and the
Yeah.
hoover and mom's cooking in the kitchen and even traffic noises outside. How does that continuous background noise really affect children's ability to relax or focus?
Yeah, I mean, such an such a good question, and I think a lot of it is about putting kind of too many competing demands on our sensory system, and also our attentional system. Having to pay attention to lots of different things and try and figure out what's important. You're watching TV, but you're also responding to messages and all of those kinds of things. So you've got this cognitive and sensory load, which is having this impact on our physiology, to the extent that, as I said, before, it's activating our kind of sympathetic nervous system. And that makes it kind of hard to kind of unplug and unwind. And in order to do that, in order to kind of get into that kind of relaxation state, the body kind of really needs to shift into kind of parasympathetic mode, or rest and digest. And that's really hard to do when the body is perceiving that there's a kind of threat, or the need to maintain vigilance to protect safety, or what might be perceived as an unsafe environment. So when you're kind of really plugged in to the external world, it's really hard to kind of come out of it and kind of relax. So often I think that's what's happening. You've got too many competing demands on your system, and that means that you can't get into that kind of rest, relaxation response which is required.
Mhm. But what's really interesting, and you've alluded to this in a previous conversation, that some sounds can really overwhelm a brain or a child, and yet other sounds seem to have the opposite effect. So when I think of, I love the sound of washing machine. I love the
Yeah.
sound of those lovely vibrations, and I hate the sound of somebody eating.
Yeah.
Whereas there are ASMR channels that are all about people eating. And so why is it that some predictable or gentle sounds can support calm and then others don't?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. And, there's lots of things probably going on. Of course, there are differences in the auditory properties of different sounds, which we know have kind of different effects. But it's also probably about the context that you're in. So, if you're really trying to concentrate on work and you've got the washing machine going, it might be
Yeah. Sorry.
distracting, even in circumstances where you might normally find it kind of relaxing.
Mm.
So a lot of this, there's a lot of variability in this, and how certain sounds can, in some contexts, be relaxing and other times be very irritating. But in general, there is this tendency for sounds that are predictable and kind of gentle to be easier to process by the brain. So it's much more able to kind of be like, okay, this is a predictable environment because I'm getting this regular input of sound in this way. And so that kind of can create a feeling of safety because it's predictable, because
Mm.
the brain likes to predict what's going on. Ooh, there's also kind of an element, I think, of control over the sensory environment that I think is really important here. If you can kind of deliberately choose to engage with certain sounds to regulate your emotions, and that might be ASMR content, but it might be an audiobook or different kinds of music. So there is a sense in which you can kind of control aspects of your sensory world to affect how you feel and support feelings that you kind of want to generate. And music, I think, is an amazing example of this. People use music to regulate their emotions in different ways. Some people might be like, okay, right, I need to feel a certain way in order to get hyped up for an event that I've got, or I want to feel very relaxed and calm. Or maybe people might want to feel sad and they actually want to experience that emotion, so might listen to different music for that. So different kinds of sound can elicit different responses as well emotionally.
And so for parents listening today who are probably thinking, well, gosh, how can I even control the noise at home? Are there any simple ways that they might be able to start thinking differently about the sound in the environment, in the house, and things that they could do?
Yeah. I mean, so as somebody who also researches sleep, I think uh, I think the effect of the sensory environment on sleep is a really important thing that could be an area of priority for people. So we've done quite a bit of research linking sensory sensitivity to sleep disturbances and problems there. And this can be particularly problematic if you live in kind of a noisy area, or there are kind of sudden noises, as you're trying to get to sleep, or, even when you're sleeping. And, this is really important because the auditory system is still active during sleep. So even if you're not awoken by the sound of traffic or, people arguing in the street, it does disrupt the sleep cycle and affect the quality of the sleep. So, you're not as likely to have deep sleep, and you might get what we can call micro arousal, so kind of awakenings, but, not full awakenings. Um, and we know from kind of decades of research that sleep is vital for absolutely everything, including our emotional well-being. So the other thing as well is that if you have poor sleep, it probably makes your sensory sensitivities worse as well because you're less able to cope. So I think that a really important kind of key thing that people could take away is about thinking really about the pre-sleep and during sleep environment, and ways of kind of curating that sensory environment in a much more intentional way, which I think would help with sleep, and then also having good sleep would also help with sensory sensitivity. So that's one of the things I think it can be really helpful.
Mhm. And so for parents listening, what's one thing you wish more people really understood about how sound affects emotional regulation?
Yeah, I think, a lot of this is about understanding that these things are often outside of our control. The sensory system has really kind of strong automatic links with our kind of physiological and emotional states in ways that we aren't necessarily aware of or can control. And that's really challenging because it means that sounds and other sensory stimuli are going to have negative effects, especially if we've got kind of exposure over long periods of time. They're going to have this kind of cumulative effect.
Mhm.
So I think in some ways, it's really important to understand that, a lot of this isn't, deliberate. These are kind of automatic processes, but that's, which is not great for kind of negative effects, but I also kind of find that quite reassuring because it suggests that we can put in deliberate ways of kind of try and control and regulate our sensory environment. We can kind of benefit really. And this could be very simple things, like using particular sounds or routines of sounds that people can implement without too much cognitive effort. So there's some small things that you can do which might have large effects. And I think it's really important to recognize that, that would be an improvement for people who are sensitive, but also probably for everybody else as well,
Oh,
which I think is really important.
Absolutely. And Julia, thank you so much for this conversation. One of the things I take away from your research is that sound is not just background. It shapes how safe we feel, how calm we feel, and how regulated the nervous system feels, which is at the center of all of this. And so for parents, this can be incredibly empowering because small shifts in the sound environment of a home can sometimes make such a big difference to how a child experiences their day and then actually leads on to their sleep in the evening. So we are very grateful to have you, Julia, as part of these Peace Path conversations. Thank you. And thanks for helping us guide this work with such fascinating research and insights. And to everyone listening, thank you for being part of this conversation. If you'd like to explore more conversations like this, you can find them through the Peace Path and HushAway, where we continue exploring how children can find peace in the little signs. So you can find us at hushaway.com. Thank you.